The journey of 18th century paper begins not in a pristine forest, but in the discarded remnants of human life, where the ragman's cart rattles through cobblestone streets, collecting the essential anatomy of the trade. In this era, before wood pulp becomes the standard, the entire industry relies upon the fibers of hemp and linen, salvaged from worn-out shirts, bed sheets, and naval ropes that have reached the end of their domestic utility. This raw material arrives at the mill in a chaotic, pungent heap, stiff with dirt and history, requiring immediate and brutal segregation before any refinement can occur. The sorting room is traditionally the domain of women, often the wives and daughters of the mill workers, who stand for 12 or 14 hours a day before tables fitted with fixed, upright blades resembling scythes. Here, amidst air thick with particulate dust that coats the lungs and grays the hair, they execute a task of immense dexterity and speed, ripping seams and buttons from the fabric and slashing the cloth into smaller scraps against the stationary knives. The hierarchy of the paper is determined here, at the hands of the sorters who categorize the rags into strictly defined grades: fine whites for writing paper, coarse grays for wrapping, and canvas for lower quality stock, while the foreman watches closely, knowing that a single piece of colored silk or wool mixed into the linen batch could ruin the uniformity of the final white sheet. Once sorted and shredded, the rags must undergo a process of controlled decomposition known as fermentation or retting, a biological breaking of the bonds that mimics the ancient natural decay of plants, but accelerated within stone vaults or large wooden tubs. The material is wetted and piled in heaps, sometimes for weeks, generating its own heat as it begins to rot, a delicate stage that requires the nose of a master craftsman to monitor. If the pile ferments too little, the fibers will remain too tough for the beaters. If it ferments too long, the cellulose will disintegrate entirely, rendering the batch useless. The smell in this section of the mill is overpowering, a distinct aroma of molding vegetable matter and stagnant water that permeates the clothes of every worker. This stage is crucial for dissolving the natural greases, starches, and remaining dirt within the weave, softening the fabric to a point where it is tender enough to be pulled apart. It is a slow, silent transformation where the strength of the woven thread is sacrificed to liberate the individual filaments, preparing the ghost of the garment to be reborn as a blank page. The relationship between the mill and the surrounding water source defines the geography of production, as the demand for pure, limpid water is non-negotiable for the washing phase that interrupts the fermentation. The murky, fermented rags are placed into perforated wooden boxes or washing troughs directly in the stream or channeled race, where the constant flow of the river carries away the filth loosened by the rotting process. Workers, often red-handed from the cold and the friction of wet cloth, turn the mass continuously with wooden poles, fighting the weight of the waterlogged fabric to ensure every inch is flushed of impurities. This is back-breaking labor, performed in the damp chill, yet it is the only way to ensure the brightness of the paper without the harsh chemical bleaches that will be invented in the following century. As the water running off the rags transitions from brown to clear, the material is deemed ready for the violence of the machine, moving from the silent, biological decay of the retting piles to the mechanical thunder that awaits inside the main mill house, where the true pulping begins. Entering the heart of the mill, one is immediately assaulted by a rhythmic, deafening thunder that shakes the very floorboards, generated by the massive water wheel turning outside and transferring its energy through a camshaft to a battery of heavy wooden trip hammers. This is the stamping mill, a piece of engineering directly descended from medieval fulling mills, where the softened, fermented rags are beaten into a fibrous slurry known as stuff. The camshaft, a stout oak trunk fitted with projecting wooden teeth, revolves slowly but with unstoppable torque, lifting the hammers, some shod with iron teeth, others with blunt iron heads, and finally plain wood, before letting them drop by gravity into the mortar troughs containing the rags and water. The noise is a ceaseless, syncopated crashing that dictates the rhythm of life in the valley, a sound so intense that mill workers often develop a specialized form of sign language to communicate, their voices utterly lost beneath the mechanical roar. The process is staged in 3 distinct batteries. The first set of hammers, equipped with sharp iron spikes, coarsely tears the fabric. The second set, with finer teeth, draws out the fibers. And the final set of smooth wood acts solely to bruise and hydrate the pulp, ensuring the fibers are long, flexible, and perfectly suspended in water. The master of the beaters must constantly adjust the flow of water into the troughs, balancing the need to wash the rags with the need to retain the fiber, creating a creamy, oatmeal-like consistency that is the lifeblood of the paper. This maceration process can take up to 30 hours or more for the finest bond paper, a slow attrition where the linen structure is utterly obliterated. The friction of the hammers generates heat, and the constant agitation introduces air bubbles, turning the dark, wet rags into a brilliant white suspension solely through mechanical force and water filtration. It is a dangerous environment. The open gears and rising hammers possess enough force to crush bone effortlessly, and the workers moving between the troughs must remain vigilant, slick with spray, and deafened by the din. They frequently stop the flow to inspect the stuff, rubbing a pinch of pulp between thumb and forefinger to check for knots or uncut threads, knowing that any irregularity at this stage will result in a lump in the finished sheet that no amount of pressing can hide. Technology in the 18th century is beginning to shift, with some advanced mills in the Netherlands and France experimenting with the Hollander beater, a rotating cylinder with knives that cuts the rags rather than pounding them, but the traditional stamping mill remains the preferred method for high-quality, long-fiber paper desired for durability. The difference is palpable in the texture. Stamped pulp retains a longer, more entangled fiber that creates a tougher sheet, whereas the Hollander cuts the fibers short, making a smoother but more brittle paper. Regardless of the machine, the goal is the same: to create a hydration so thorough that the cellulose fibers swell and become covered in a microscopic mucilage, allowing them to bond chemically when dried. When the pulp is finally deemed ready, it is flushed into a reserve chest, a holding tank where it is kept agitated to prevent settling, waiting to be delivered to the vat. The transition from the violent mechanical pounding to the silent, still waters of the dipping vat marks the shift from brute force engineering to the delicate, almost surgical precision of the artisan. The dipping room is warm, humid, and quiet compared to the stamping floor, dominated by the large wooden vat, or cuve, which is kept at a tepid temperature by a small charcoal furnace, or pistolet, built into its side to improve drainage and comfort. Here stands the vat man, the most skilled and highly paid artisan in the manufacture, whose muscle memory dictates the weight and uniformity of every single sheet produced. He works with a mold, a rectangular wooden frame strung with a fine wire mesh, and a decal, a removable wooden rim that fits over the mold to contain the pulp. The physical toll of this station is immense. The vat man leans over the warm, milky slurry of pulp and water, executing a complex compound movement thousands of times a day. He dips the mold vertically into the vat, turns it horizontal beneath the surface, and lifts it out with a specific amount of liquid, estimating the weight of the future paper purely by the resistance in his arms. It is a task that deforms the body over decades, often leaving older vatmen with a characteristic stoop and enlarged asymmetric shoulder muscles from the repetitive strain of lifting the water-laden mold. Crucial to the formation of the paper is the shake, a signature, bidirectional vibration the vatman applies immediately after lifting the mold, shaking it first from right to left, then front to back, in the fleeting seconds before the water drains away. This motion is the secret to strong paper. It forces the floating fibers to cross and interlock in multiple directions, creating a wove or laid web that will not easily tear in one direction. If the shake is too violent, the sheet becomes uneven. If too weak, the paper will be grain-heavy and weak. As the water cascades through the wire mesh, leaving the mat of fibers behind, the vatman must judge the look-through of the sheet, ensuring the suspension is perfectly level. He then slides the mold, now heavy with the wet, fragile sheet, along a bridge plank to his partner, the coucher, while simultaneously receiving a fresh mold to begin the cycle again. This handoff must be seamless, a continuous loop of dipping, shaking, and passing that requires a rhythmic synchronization between the two men, often sung to or paced by a silent count, maintaining a production speed that can yield several reams a day. The equipment itself is a marvel of craft. The wire mesh of the mold leaves a faint impression on the paper. The laid lines running horizontally and chain lines running vertically, along with the watermark. A wire design sewn onto the mesh that indents the pulp to create the manufacturer's logo or symbol, visible only when held to the light. These molds are expensive and fragile, prone to sagging or breaking under the constant water pressure, and are repaired nightly to ensure the paper remains flat. The vatman also manages the consistency of the vat, adding fresh pulp from the reserve chest at regular intervals to replace what he removes, stirring the mix with a pole to prevent the heavy fibers from sinking to the bottom. It is a battle against variable density. As the day wears on and fatigue sets in, maintaining the exact same thickness for the 1,000th sheet as for the first requires a supreme act of focus. The sheet at this stage is barely solid, a saturated layer of slime with no structural integrity, held together only by the tension of the water and the wire, waiting to be transferred to the felt, where it will finally leave the mold and begin its transition to independence. Don't let these stories dissolve in the river of time. Leave your watermark on the channel by clicking subscribe and help us forge the next chapter of history. The moment the vatman passes the mold, the responsibility shifts to the coucher, a figure whose physical endurance must match the vatman's precision. Standing on the opposite side of the vat, the coucher seizes the heavy mold and flips it with a practiced fluid motion, pressing the wet sheet against a felt, a piece of woven wool blanket slightly larger than the paper. This action requires a specific rolling leverage. The paper, having a stronger affinity for the texture of the wool than the wire of the mold, adheres to the felt in a clean transfer, leaving the mold empty to be slid back to the vatman. The coucher then covers this new sheet with another felt, building a sandwich of wool and paper known as a post. This stack grows steadily, layer by layer, rising to a standard height of 144 sheets, a choir of work that represents an immense accumulated weight of water and fiber. The coordination here is critical. If the coucher is too slow, the vatman waits. If he is too fast or rough, the delicate web of wet fiber crushes or wrinkles against the wool, destroying the sheet instantly. It is a dance of damp wool and wet cellulose performed in a puddle of drainage, where the rhythm of the work dictates the output of the entire mill. Once the post is complete, the operation shifts from dexterity to brute force, requiring the entire crew, often summoned by a shout or a bell, to man the great screw press. This massive wooden apparatus, anchored deeply into the foundations of the mill to withstand tons of vertical pressure, is the first true test of the paper's integrity. The post is slid beneath the platen, and the workers grasp the long wooden lever, the bar, walking it around in a circle to drive the screw down. As the pressure mounts, the water begins to weep from the stack, first in a trickle, and then in a gushing torrent of white water, milky with lost fiber and size, cascading over the sides of the press and onto the floor. This initial pressing is violent but necessary. It expels the vast majority of the water held in the suspension, reducing the thickness of the post by nearly half and forcing the fibers into their final interlocked density. The men strain against the bar, their boots slipping on the wet stones, groaning with the effort to achieve maximum compression, a physical exertion that often results in hernias or back injuries, common ailments of the trade. The compression does more than dry. It imparts the texture of the felt onto the surface of the paper, a tooth that will later grab the writer's ink. After the maximum pressure is achieved and held for a specific duration to set the sheet, the bar is reversed and the screw released. Now begins the delicate work of the layman, who must disassemble the compressed post. The paper is no longer fluid, but it is far from durable. It is a moist, limp skin, akin to a wet flower petal. The layman peels the felt away, lifting the damp sheet with extreme care to avoid tearing the edges or leaving finger marks, and stacks the paper in a pack solely of paper, removing the wool dividers. This separation is fraught with risk. A sheet that sticks too firmly to the felt is lost. The felts are returned to the coucher to begin the next post. While the packs of damp paper are often pressed lightly a second time, without the felts, to smooth out the wool marks and remove hairs or surface irregularities, a refinement step that separates master paper makers from common manufacturers. From the wet, noisy floor of the mill, the paper, now a coherent but fragile solid known as water leaf, is carried up narrow stairs to the drying loft, a space defined by silence, height, and the manipulation of wind. These upper stories are architectural instruments in themselves, designed with rows of vertical louvered shutters on all sides that can be adjusted to control the airflow with absolute precision. The drying process is not merely about evaporation, it is about tension and shrinkage. If the paper dries too quickly, it will cockle and curl, becoming unmanageable. If it dries too slowly in humid weather, it will mold and rot on the ropes. The master of the loft, or loftman, reads the weather like a sailor, opening the shutters on the windward side just enough to admit a breeze while adjusting the leeward side to create a draft, constantly tuning the building to the day's atmospheric conditions. In winter, or during damp spells, the loft is a place of anxiety, where the threat of a ruined batch hangs as heavy as the moisture in the air. The hanging of the paper is a task of extreme delicacy, performed using a cross, a T-shaped wooden tool, to lift several sheets at a time from the pack and drape them over the trebles. These trebles are ropes made of cow hair or horse hair, coated in beeswax to prevent staining the paper, strung in long parallel lines across the vast, cathedral-like space of the attic. The worker maneuvers the damp spur of paper onto the rope, ensuring it hangs perfectly straight. Any fold or crease at this stage will become a permanent scar as the fiber dries and hardens. The loft fills with thousands of hanging sheets, resembling laundry day for a giant, creating a maze of white walls that flutter softly in the draft. As the water evaporates, the chemical bonds between the cellulose fibers tighten, shrinking the sheet by a considerable percentage. This physical contraction is powerful. The paper pulls against its own weight and the friction of the rope, developing the characteristic backbone and rattle of quality stock. Once dry, the paper has transformed, but it remains absorbent essentially a sheet of blotting paper that would soak up ink like a sponge, rendering writing illegible. This state, the water leaf, is only an intermediate stage. The loftman must judge the dryness by touch and sound. A crisp snap indicates the fibers are set. The harvesting of the dry sheets is faster, but no less careful. They are gathered in bunches, creating a distinct rustling sound that fills the loft, a sharp contrast to the damp silence of the hanging. The sheets are stacked again, often allowed to rest in a pile to equalize the humidity remaining in the fibers, a process called sweating. This rest period relieves the internal stresses caused by the drying on the rope, allowing the paper to lie flat. However, the sheet is still raw, a thirsty matrix of cellulose waiting for the final chemical intervention that will make it fit for the quill. To transform the absorbent water leaf into writing paper, it must be sealed against liquid, a process called sizing. This operation takes place in the sizing room, often located near a slaughterhouse or tannery connection, for the primary ingredient is animal gelatin. The size is brewed from the boiling of vellum shavings, leather parings, and sometimes hooves or horns, reduced over days into a foul-smelling, viscous, golden glue. To this glutinous soup, alum is added as a hardener and preservative. The sizing tub is kept hot, filled with this protein-rich liquor, and the smell is often nauseating, a stark contrast to the clean scent of the linen pulp. The sizing boy, or worker, takes a spur of dry paper, a small stack held loosely, and dips it entirely into the hot bath, fanning the sheets underwater to ensure the liquid penetrates every pore and coats every fiber. This is a dangerous moment for the paper. The hot liquid relaxes the fibers again, risking disintegration if handled too roughly. After the dip, the saturated stack is lifted out, dripping with gelatin, and immediately subjected to another pressing. This press is lighter but critical. Its purpose is to force the size deep into the microstructure of the sheet and to squeeze out the excess surface liquid, which is caught and returned to the tub. The chemistry here is vital. The gelatin fills the microscopic voids between the fibers, while the alum acts as a mordant, fixing the protein to the cellulose and preventing the size from rotting later. Without this step, ink would feather or bleed. With it, the paper gains a hard, impermeable surface that allows the pen to glide and the ink to sit crisply on top. The sized paper, now wet again but sticky and prone to adhering to its neighbors, must be separated carefully. This parting is tedious work, often done by women or apprentices who peel the sticky sheets apart one by one to prevent them from drying into a solid brick of glue and paper. Following the separation, the paper must be dried a second time, returning to the loft but handled with even greater caution. The drying of sized paper is unforgiving. If the temperature varies too much, the size can turn hazy or brittle. Once dry, the sheet is significantly stiffer, possessing a rattle and a snap that denotes quality. However, the surface is often rough from the re-wetting and drying cycle. The final texture is not yet achieved. The paper is strong and ink-resistant, but it lacks the smooth, burnished finish required by fine stationers. It is a rugged, utilitarian object, armored in animal glue, waiting for the final cosmetic violence that will polish it into a luxury good. The journey from the reeking sizing tub back to the airy loft completes the chemical construction of the paper, leaving only the mechanical finishing to close the cycle. The paper, now sized and dried, possesses a surface that is hard and impermeable, but its texture remains rugged, cockled, and unrefined, unfit for the delicate glide of a quill. To correct this, the sheets enter the cell, or finishing room, a domain largely governed by women whose touch is deemed more sensitive than that of the men who work the heavy vats. The first phase of this smoothing is the exchange, a tedious but essential manual algorithm. Workers dismantle the dried packs and restack them, meticulously shifting the order so that a sheet from the top of the pile moves to the middle and one from the middle moves to the bottom. This rotation ensures that the lingering humidity is redistributed perfectly evenly across the batch, and that the weight of the stack presses out the grossest wrinkles. The friction of sheet against sheet during this constant shuffling begins to burnish the surface slightly, but it is merely the prelude to the true mechanical polishing that will force the paper into submission. For the highest quality writing stock, the mill employs the glazing hammer, a terrifyingly heavy, smooth-faced iron mallet powered by the same water wheel that drives the pulpers. The paper is stacked into thick wads, often protected by polished boards or leather skins at the top and bottom to prevent burning. As the cam lifts and drops the hammer, it strikes the dry pack with immense force, not to crush it, but to compress the fibers into a dense mirror-flat plane. The friction generated by these repetitive impacts is so intense that the paper becomes hot to the touch, physically fusing the size and cellulose into a unified, glossy surface. The operator must move the packet constantly under the hammer's head to ensure even coverage. A moment's hesitation could result in the hammer striking the same spot twice, generating enough heat to singe or shatter the brittle stack. This is the loudest operation in the finishing room, a sharp, metallic ringing that contrasts with the dull thud of the wet-end stampers. In smaller mills or for specific orders, the glazing is done by hand using a sleek flint stone or a polished agate burnisher. A worker creates a rhythm, scrubbing the stone back and forth over each individual sheet with significant pressure, strip by strip, until the paper shines with a satin luster. This method, while slower, produces a finish of extraordinary delicacy often reserved for the finest ledger paper or artistic stock. Whether by hammer or by hand, this stage is where the paper loses its textile character, the memory of the woven rag, and gains the smooth, impersonal perfection of a manufactured good. It is a transformation of touch. What was once a discarded fibrous cloth has been beaten, drowned, glued, and hammered, until it feels like a crisp, unified substance, ready to receive the ink without resistance. Once glazed, the paper faces its final and most ruthless inquisitor, the sorter. The salle is designed for light, often featuring large north-facing windows to provide a consistent, glare-free illumination that reveals every hidden defect within the sheet. Here, the salle women stand for hours, lifting each sheet rapidly to the light, scanning the transparency for the slightest aberration. The speed at which they work is bewildering to the uninitiated, their hands moving in a blur of white, yet their eyes catch microscopic faults. A monk or friar, a blackened lump of unbeaten rag, a hair from the felts, a drop of water that fell during pressing, a tear, or an uneven distribution of pulp known as clouding. This is the quality control checkpoint that determines the mill's reputation. A single ream of bad paper sold to a city printer can destroy a master papermaker's credit for years. The sorting creates a rigid caste system for the product. The flawless sheets are thrown onto the good pile, destined to be wrapped as first-quality stock. The sheets with minor cosmetic blemishes, perhaps a slight variation in color or a small speck, are tossed to the retrie pile, often marked with a distinct symbol on the wrapper, sold at a discount to less discerning buyers like grocers or apothecaries. The broken or cassé sheets, those with holes, tears, or serious structural failures, are cast aside to be repulped or sold as cheap wrapping for hardware. The sorters carry small penknives and, with surgical precision, They will sometimes scrape away a surface knot or lump, salvaging a sheet from the retray pile to the good pile in a split second. The floor of the salle is covered in shavings, the dust of these corrections, and the air is dry and quiet, filled only with the crisp rustle of thousands of sheets being shuffled and judged. This classification is not merely technical, but economic. The difference in price between good and retrait is substantial. The master papermaker often paces the salle, inspecting the sort, ensuring that the standards remain high, but also that not too much paper is being rejected, as every sheet in the retrait pile represents a loss of profit on the same amount of raw material and labor. It is a balance of greed and pride. The sorters, paid by the day, or sometimes by the ream, must maintain an exhausting pace while serving as the final barrier between the chaos of the manufacturing process and the exacting demands of the consumer. A sheet that passes this room is considered finished, having survived water, fire, iron, and scrutiny to earn its place in the ream. The final act of the mill is the assembly of the ream, the universal unit of the paper trade. The counter, often a senior worker with hands calloused by paper cuts, gathers the sorted sheets into quires. Traditionally, a quire consists of 24 sheets, folded in half or left flat, depending on the size. 20 of these quires are stacked to form a ream of 480 sheets, though printers' reams might swell to 500 or 516 to account for waste at the press. This counting is done with a rhythmic flicking of the corners, a sound like a deck of cards being shuffled endlessly. To protect the valuable white paper inside, the top and bottom quires of the ream are often made of cording sheets, slightly damaged or lower quality paper, to act as a buffer against the ropes and handling of transport. The wrapping is a branding exercise as much as a protective measure. The ream is encased in a coarse, sturdy brown or blue paper, often made in the same mill from the dirtiest, unbleachable rags and ropes that were rejected at the very start of the process. This wrapper is sealed with hot wax or tied with strong twine, ensuring the package is tight and solid as a brick. The mill's label is then affixed or stamped onto the outside, a woodblock print displaying the maker's name, the coat of arms, or the iconic symbol of the mill, a beehive, a fool's cap, or a post horn, serving as a guarantee of quality to the stationer in London, Paris, or Philadelphia. These packages are heavy, dense objects, representing not just hours of labor, but a significant capital investment in linen and energy. Loaded onto carts, or preferably flat-bottomed barges to avoid the vibrations of the road, the paper begins its journey away from the noise of the trip hammers and the smell of the retting vaults. It leaves the valley of its birth to enter the cities of the Enlightenment, destined to become the substrate of bureaucracy, theology, science, and revolution. The transformation is absolute. The soiled, discarded rags of the peasantry and the poor, collected from the gutter, have been transmuted by water and mechanics into the pristine white vehicle of human thought. As the cart rolls away, the mill continues its thunderous cycle. The ragman arrives with a new load of old shirts, and the vatman dips his mold once more, unaware that the sheet he forms might one day carry a Declaration of Independence or the diagram of a new engine that will eventually render his craft obsolete. Just as the ream is wrapped and sealed for its journey, our work here is finished. But yours is just beginning. Subscribe and share to carry this history forward, ensuring the knowledge of the old masters never fades from memory.